And on that piece of paper, I wrote confidently, under no circumstances are my remains to be traded for, in any kind of political swap for prisoners. Just
Yeah.
freaking leave me there. I don't know if anyone would have respected those wishes, but that's really how I feel. I don't want my remains to be the cause of more broken families in my country. But yeah, when you're in these rooms, just watching the same scenery for hours and hours and hours, and you're thinking about home and you're thinking about if you're going to get home, the time just becomes so strange and elastic after a while. And then when something shakes up your reality like that, you suddenly see somebody running towards you with a gun, even at that range, it's kind of scary. And so that was one of the more terrifying engagements that I encountered.
Yeah.
Yeah, hey, you did a pretty good job on that first one. I listened to part of it.
Welcome back. Super exciting to have you back. We got some feedback. People were very impressed with you and thought you were an excellent storyteller and stuff.
Appreciate it.
And I wanted to give you an opportunity because every time I appear in public in anything, when I listen back, I'm like, I should have formulated that better, or like, oh, I misremembered that. Did you hear anything that you wanted to clarify or correct or anything? I thought you did a great job.
Yeah, I don't think there was any there were any big mistakes that I wanted to correct, or things that I thought were kind of unclear. I think you did a pretty good job of asking some of the right questions, and yeah, I felt like we pretty much we had a good discussion. It felt pretty good, and yeah, I mean it's only natural to try and say things perfectly in hindsight. I didn't listen to all of it, unfortunately, so maybe there were things that I would have preferred to be said otherwise, but that's life. You get one shot, and sometimes it ain't perfect, or
No, but
always.
the fact that if you didn't listen to all of it, that means you didn't obsess over every detail and it all flowed naturally. That's good.
Yeah, I feel like it's better that way.
Other people have listened to all of it, which is why we're here, because you left us on a massive cliffhanger. Anyone who hasn't listened to the first part, to recap in a quick 20 seconds, you had to leave medical residency in New York to join your reserve unit in Israel when the war started in October 2023, and then soon after you find yourself walking on foot in into Gaza, and initially tense times but not too much contact with the actual enemy, and then we arrived at this house where you were very close to another building and there was some suspicious movement there. Is that where we were? Yeah.
Yeah, I think we left off just there. There's a gentleman in my outfit who saw some movement inside a house that we were gonna hunker down in for the night. And when he brought it to our attention, he wasn't taken very seriously by our superiors, which I thought was a shame, because this was a soldier who I saw as highly reliable. Like I said, I think I mentioned this in the last chapter, but really a man of few words, and so few that when he's saying something or when he's adamant about anything, you can absolutely rely on it. And so, our command wasn't so sure that he had seen what he thought he saw, which was flashlights basically going on and off in a house that was just opposite us, just across a small road. And so, if we had just stayed there for the night and done nothing about that house, it felt like it was a disaster waiting to happen. So our small squad that was in the house made a request to have the armor that we were associated with on that operation to make some moves, maybe put a shell in the house. I'll remind everyone that we already had been dropping leaflets on this area, and there were no civilians. I hadn't seen a civilian at that point the entire time. Later on, we did see some civilians off at a distance, but until this point, everyone had fled. The buildings were empty. All we had seen up until then was entrances to tunnels and many, many booby traps on houses and doors inside houses. And so we were kind of on edge when our request to have the armor deal with this house was declined. And after, in the hour or so after we realized that they weren't going to authorize that move, we insisted on letting half of our squad go out on a night movement. And so we did. We kind of snuck out the rear end of the house we were in, took an angle to the side and flanked the house. And, we sat there and just watching for a little bit to see if we would see any more movement. We didn't. And so then you do what you call like a little shake up. So, I put a few rounds through one or two windows, see if there's any movement after that. There wasn't. And then after that, we just continued to shoot the house because we trusted that there was some kind of activity going on in there. Anyways, after we did that short night movement, it was probably, all of like 45 minutes to an hour. Got back to the house, did a head count, made sure everyone was cool. And then just passed the night as we would in any other structure, just kind of counting the hours and switching off people with the different stand posts where you're guarding. We had night vision and radio communications with various different outfits in our area. So the night kind of passed without anything too interesting. And then the next morning, it was actually more like afternoon because it took time to get moving and get authorization the next day, which again we were not happy with because we were still stuck like very close to this house where there was a verified movement from. So finally around the afternoon we get permission to approach the house and go and see what's going on inside. So it's me and my immediate superior, and we're leading the rest of our unit to move while another team in a different building is kind of watching closely and giving us clearing us for crossing. As we approach the house, it's immediately obvious that the front door is, someone had been tinkering with it, and there was some wires just on the other side of the door that was a crack open. So we put some sticky C4 on it, took a step back, and then, you expect to see a certain size of an explosion when you put on a known amount of C4 on the door. But the explosion that happened after our charges went off, it was obvious that there was something else already attached to that door. That's why we took a safe distance. Kind of blew out like the whole first floor. There was like a fire, but it was a pretty strong and sturdy structure, and it was a small amount of C4. And the explosion afterward didn't seem like it was really going to take the structure down as a whole. So we still waited to make sure that it was safe to go in. And we also have people who work with us who evaluate whether or not they think structures are safe. These are guys who have lots of experience with engineering, both in the civilian realm and the military realm, by the way, very often. And so after a waiting period, we moved into the house. I hadn't seen any activity that whole day, but we found on the second and third floor of the building tons of ammunition, 5.56, 7.62, wagon of sniper rifles, K-47s, of course, grenades, like just enough to supply a small squad for a little while.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. Sorry. First of all, it seems very clever of them to bob their heads a bit to be seen in a window and then use their time to booby trap the door and then just disappear, or to draw you in to investigate and then try to blow you up at the door. That all seems very sort of standard terrorist tactic, but
Yeah.
why
I
would
mean,
they then leave their weapons behind if the plan
so
was to shoot and scoot in that sense? Why are they leaving all this shit behind?
yeah, so that was part of the discussion we had in the debrief. My assumption, and some people agree with me, some people didn't, but my assumption was that there weren't enough people in the house to carry all that equipment out in the time that they wanted to leave. They probably wanted to sort of like, shoot and scoot, as you said, without the shooting part. Think about it from their perspective. They don't know when we're going to put a tank shell through the building. They don't know when we're going to blow the door out with C4. And so they might have assumed that we're going to move after that night movement into the house, and they wanted to skedaddle as soon as possible. Of course, these are all theories. We'll never really know. We don't even know how many people were actually in that house. All we know is that once we got in there, all we found was a bunch of military equipment, military paraphernalia, some radio stuff, and then like a small hole in the back of the building where likely they had escaped. So yet again, I know I left you on a little bit of a cliffhanger last time, and I was kind of laughing to myself as you'd said that because I kind of felt like it was a dud of a cliffhanger because there's no like big shootout scene where the hero takes the prize.
I
But there,
think for most listeners, I think the a booby trap door in Khan Yunis is intense and scary enough. Most of us don't hang out there too often, you know.
fair enough, and I wish you never have to, and I hope to never have to ever again. But yeah, I mean, you really do get used to that. I saw so many booby trap buildings, doors, windows, even down to the most like primitive, like literally grenade on a string. I'm not even kidding. And also more advanced than that, obviously. But that was the most common thing that I saw. We were face to face with enemy combatants occasionally, but the thing that I dealt with mostly was booby traps empty buildings slash homes slash sheds, you name it. And that really is just the nature of the warfare, of the guerrilla terrorist style warfare, and also what puts us at such a major disadvantage in that sense. Obviously, militarily, we have a major advantage. We're much more professional military. We're much better equipped. And that's part of the reason that they want to, they don't want to face us and fight us face on. They'd prefer to, shoot and scoot and booby trap.
You operate like a professional military, but Israel is a sort of people's army.
It's true.
Well, Israel has fully professional units that are different. Like there are professional soldiers.
I mean, yeah, I guess it depends what is implied by the word professional. When I say professional, what I mean is that we are trained in conventional warfare. There are rules and regulations. There are rules of engagement, all of that. That doesn't exist for Hamas. It didn't exist for the Viet Cong, and it doesn't exist for Hezbollah. It doesn't exist for a lot of the terror organizations that exist and operate in Africa today. And so, yeah, like that was my only point. Yeah, you're 100% right that we are reservists. We are, professional soldiers in that sense.
Yeah. Another question, you mentioned that you work with these people who help you, like engineering related people who will check out buildings, whether they're safe to go into, because obviously Gaza was under massive aerial bombardment as well, lots of rubble, lots of semi-standing structures. So there was an incident, I don't remember what month or whether you guys were in at the time or did you hear about it?
Yeah.
I believe it was actually some of the guys who died were in the unit I used to serve in, but there was a structure that fell on a lot of soldiers.
Yeah, there were several incidents just like that. There were even incidents in which the armor, like the tanks working alongside the combat infantry, were given orders to shoot at a structure that was somewhat in the same area as buildings where soldiers were, and those buildings ended up coming down on their heads. And yeah, there were several episodes of that, at least 3 really bad ones that I can remember. Yeah, very, very difficult terrain to operate in. It has its advantages over being in a place like Lebanon, let's say, where you're fighting in the mountains. But yeah, very complicated in terms of relying on structures, knowing where you can and can't step.
Yes, and for all of our little engineering perverts out there, an interesting point about like the environment that you're in and how structures stand, and especially tunnels, is also the soil, the ground that you're on. So Gaza is by the Mediterranean coast, and it's mostly mud, sand.
Mud and sand.
That
very
type
malleable.
of
Very malleable.
Yeah, which kind of makes it even more impressive, all the tunnels that Hezbollah has managed to build, bunkers and tunnels, because that's all rock, and they're tunneling through mountains and shit over there.
Yeah, well, they have much better equipment, and they probably needed it a lot more too, as you're saying.
Yeah. So anyway, now we're like a week in when the first booby trap door is encountered. So how long do you guys end up being in there in Gaza overall in the first deployment now? Like how many weeks are there to go before there's any chance of going home or anything?
So we have no idea while we're in there. They don't even like put the idea in your head that you're ever going home, even though your superiors might know that there are plans to pull you out. You're just kind of kept out of the dark, and I think that's for good reason. You want to stay focused. So we were in for a total on that deployment for 1 month, and then after that, there's like some training, some refreshers. They had us all sit with psychologists if we wanted to sort of deconstruct what had happened, and then redeployment in Lebanon for about a month after that, for which I actually was not present. So, you're gonna have to find somebody else for the cliffhanger on that one.
Yeah, no, I think we're all aware that I was there. I wasn't seen at work for a couple of months. I'm just kidding.
Put on your clothes.
By the way, I have to say that we have a mutual friend, and roughly at the same time as you're in there doing all this shit, like him and I were on the phone and stuff, and for about 10 years the likelihood we both said that we would go back into any of this kind of stuff was about 0%. And then as this stuff went on, and like the October 7th attacks and this war started, I just like had this creeping sensation that percentage of me going back had gone above 0%.
How high above zero?
It wasn't 13 or even 11 or even 9 at any point, but it was definitely not 0 anymore. And then and then I called our mutual friend, and he was and he just started laughing when I said that. He said I had the same exact thoughts. Like, it's not 0% anymore. Like, somebody, like, they seem like they need help.
Yeah, yeah. I think, especially in the beginning, when things seemed really, really desperate, I feel like a lot of people who might have been in your situation would have had similar feelings. But then, as time went on, it seemed like it was more controlled. There were obviously talks about ceasefires and ending the war, and it wasn't clear where it was going. So I think we got more comfortable with the reality at some point. I know I certainly did. After that deployment, I was at a point where I had to basically choose between the future of my career and continuing with my unit. And it was difficult back and forth in my own head, and talking to some people who really mean a lot to me, and I trust their wisdom. Both friends of mine in the military and family members and people who I worked with at the hospital. And so I chose to put my reserve duty on hold. I didn't join my unit going into Lebanon, and they were there for about 3 weeks to a month. And then, yeah, that was actually very difficult for me. I felt very conflicted about that for a long time.
I wanted to check one more thing about this deployment in Gaza. So we've covered about a week up to this booby trap door. So in the following weeks, I mean, there's a few things I'm interested in. I think many others too. Number one is obviously any more encounters that were close calls with the enemy, or any actual firefights, or was it all just rolling up to booby traps and blowing them up? And then secondly, obviously at this point the world is hearing about thousands and thousands of civilian casualties.
Mm.
What did you see? Were there like a lot of bodies to be dealt with that had died in airstrikes, or anything like that that you guys had to deal with?
Okay, yeah, both very important questions. So I'll start with your second one. I was in Gaza for a month. Obviously, in Gaza, the civilian realm and the military realm are one and the same in some sense, because the tunnel systems exist underneath all of the civilian infrastructure. There aren't many like buildings above ground that are like marked officially as Hamas headquarters. They exist, but mostly they operate in civilian infrastructure intentionally, by design. Some of the areas we had been in were targeted in precision strikes before we had arrived. We saw some of the damage of that. Some buildings collapsed, obviously, some craters and fields and that sort of thing. I didn't see a single civilian corpse, not even one, when I was there. And we covered some ground. We were like, I don't know exactly how to tell you in like square kilometers the amount of territory that I had seen on foot moving around. But I can tell you it was a decent amount. And I can
Did you
tell you
get to
that
see the beach at least?
no, we were on the other side of the city. Yeah, maybe like vaguely in the horizon, but no ocean view for us, unfortunately, which is probably a good thing. It's less distracting without it. But yeah, so I'm not saying that like no civilians were killed in Gaza. I wouldn't be such a fool as to, imply such a thing. But it seems like by the time we were going into Khan Yunis, which was like a month or so about into the war, civilians were taking the directives pretty seriously. I know earlier in the war, Hamas was doing everything it could to make it difficult for civilians to follow the directives and to flee. And there are even verified reports of them being violent with people who were trying to follow the IDF directives. So yeah, I didn't see a single civilian corpse. I saw signs of damage to civilian infrastructure. Some of the homes we were in were severely damaged. A lot of, their stuff was like kind of everywhere. So then in terms of engagements that we had after that first one, there were no like firefights from close range. It didn't happen like that at all. A building would get shot at. We're a unit with like 100 plus men moving, and we're like attached to other units with 100 plus men. So you're very large in that sense. And so like it wasn't always my building that was being shot at, but it would be one of the other ones in our quadrant, and you would be aware of it and like not necessarily feel that you're being shot at. Then there's like more severe things like a mortar warning going off, and then you hear the shells exploding. Nothing hit too close to where I was. There was one incident that was kind of scary when I was in one of the watch rooms. When we set up in these houses, there's very specific procedures by which we isolate rooms and make sure that no light could go in and out of them, and we used them to survey the area. And so I was in one of these rooms with my partner. You're paired up in pairs. And me and my close friend were in this room watching our section, and suddenly we see somebody who's like sprinting towards us, and clearly not a civilian. He's holding a rifle, and he was actually barefoot, which made me feel better instantly. And we opened fire in his direction. And he was about, say, like 300-400 meters away. I use an automatic light machine gun. So at that range, it's not like I'm placing specific rounds. I'm just kind of getting the direction. And my partner is a sharpshooter. So he has a scope, and he verified that we hit this guy, and he was downed and bleeding. And, he bled out in the 20 or so minutes after that. And later, so we had a drone look over what was going on, and we see this guy holding a gun, sprawled out on the floor with a walkie-talkie on his belt, most likely a spotter, most likely some kind of bait that we were supposed to take. But yeah, when you're in these rooms, just like watching the same scenery for hours and hours and hours, and you're thinking about home, and you're thinking about if you're gonna get home, the time just becomes so strange and elastic after a while. And then when something shakes up your reality like that, like you suddenly see somebody running towards you with a gun, even at that range, it's kind of scary. And so that was like one of the more terrifying engagements that I had encountered.
Yeah, I remember myself back. We never went in like you guys, so nothing that intense. But I remember it was the same on that border in general. It was this
Yeah.
like reality where days just go into nights and you don't really know what day it is. And then suddenly this weird like haze of
Yeah.
existence is
Yeah.
punctuated by the alarm that's now there's something happening. And when it does happen, it's never anything good.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to describe that to people who haven't experienced it, right? It's like, people think of war as this noisy, bombastic, crazy thing, and often it is also, but there's a lot of silence in between sometimes that is broken. Yeah.
Yeah, like let's say if you're hit by an ID or just a mine. I don't know. Some, I guess, popular culture films or TV shows have captured this correctly, where it's just a routine day where you just get dressed, put your equipment on, and make the same jokes you always make, and then boom, right? And then it comes out of nowhere. And it's not like this thing where there's exciting music like a Hitchcock movie where it's like do 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 and then it blows up. No, it just comes out of nowhere.
Yeah.
So tell me, so you're in there for a month. Is this your only sort of confirmed kill of an armed enemy, or are there more incidents like this where?
No, that was pretty much the only one. I mean, there were other incidences where we were shooting into suspicious looking areas, and we found tunnel shafts, obviously. So who knows? But yeah, I think that was the only incident where it was like clear that there was someone with a gun and out to get us.
So did all of you walk away from it? No casualties?
In my immediate platoon, no casualties on that deployment. Thankfully, someone caught a little bit of shrapnel in his leg, but nothing serious. And that was actually from like friendly fire, not friendly fire, but like he had been shooting too close, or someone else was shooting too close. We're not really sure exactly what happened, and must have caught a piece of something that was immediately in front of them or something like that. But yeah, no serious casualties. Yeah, so basically 95% of the work was slow, methodically moving through buildings and finding that they were trapped and dismantling the traps, slowly moving out of the buildings, then back in, finding tunnel shafts, finding munitions and blowing them up. It was very not Rambo-esque. Much to the disappointment of my former 14-year-old self, but also much to my gratitude as an adult, because you understand how fickle and crazy that stuff can be.
Yeah. So, what did it feel like when you got the orders to fall back and back into Israel? Was there jubilation? Did you have to walk back, or did someone give you a ride?
No, yeah, we caught a ride. At that point, the area behind us was established. There was a clear, supply route that had been used. It wasn't 100% safe. It was attacked several times while we were there, but it was more or less secure. And we got on armored personnel carriers, went back, and jeeps and stuff. It felt unreal. That's also something that's difficult for people to understand. about living in Israel. We talked about this a little bit in our previous episode, about how you don't get to really feel safe anywhere because there's like literally some kind of attempt on a civilian life or a soldier's life every day. But the other side of that is like you're in a war zone and then 30 minutes you're back in quote unquote safety. Yeah, it felt really crazy. It was kind of a paradoxical feeling too, because on the one hand, we had all survived and I made it back and I was going to see my family again. And on the other hand, we like knew that the work wasn't done. I think going through that month and working through the tedious terrain there and the tedious work of getting into some of these small buildings and looking for munitions, finding it, and disposing of it. It's kind of like when the only civilian analogy I could think of is like when you arrive to work on Monday morning and realize how much you have to do. And it kind of feels like it's impossible to get to the goal. That's kind of how it felt. And that was even, despite the fact that we were celebrating our return, making it back. What I was saying before was like, you're 30 minutes away from this dangerous house that's under threat of exploding or being shot at. And then shortly thereafter, my wife is picking me up in the middle of the night from an empty parking lot. And just surreal. Absolutely
So
surreal.
they had returned to Israel, your family?
Yeah, at that point, my wife...
We left them in New York in the previous episode, yeah.
Actually, my wife, so she stayed in New York for a time. She was following my lead on when it would be time for her to come back to Israel with our child. Because, at that point, we still didn't know, was this going to turn into a regional conflict? Was the northern border going to open up? Was it going to become unsafe to be anywhere in Israel at some point? But anyways, by the time I was being discharged, I went to see her. And, it was like the first time I'd seen her in a long time. And it was just crazy. I have emotions. I'm just not highly emotional person. Especially feel like I have control of them when I want to. And like, when we hugged each other, we just both kind of broke down because it was, you spend that whole month just thinking like, what if it's me? What if, what if I'm not going to make it?
Little bitch you are.
Yeah. And then I turned into a crying little bitch. But that little bitch exists in all of us. We all have that core somewhere, the little child. I found mine that night. But yeah, again, very paradoxical because there was no sense of achievement. There was no sense of like a victory. That's very important for soldiers to have, obviously, for good reason.
Yeah. Well, I have a few thoughts about all of that. Now, number one thought for anyone who wants a sort of popular culture reference of what it might look like is Fauda, the TV series. The first couple of seasons are good, then it turns mega silly. But in one of the silly seasons, might be season 3, at the end of the season, there's this moment where they film, which they did very well, this scene where they film Israeli soldiers walking back from Gaza after doing something in there and then coming back, and the way they walk in formation and like they filmed like the elation on everyone's face, and I feel like that was that very much depicted what it feels like, because it feels like you're walking back from a violent place. You're almost traveling in time. You're kind of crossing the border between Eastern and Western world, right? We can argue about how much Israel really is a Western place. I have some comments on that, but the feeling is crazy when you cross back into Israel. Not to even mention seeing your family again. I'm just saying just that crossing of kind of returning to the safety of the Western world in a way.
The question of whether or not Israel is a Western country, it's a good question. I think it would depend on what you mean by Western. We can get into that another time. But it does feel like you're stepping back from a chaos, and that's what it is. I mean, maybe it's not a violent place to be in a day-to-day basis, but for an Israeli soldier, for a Jew to be walking around Gaza, not a very safe place. And when you step back from that precipice, it does feel, there is a certain jubilation you feel on a personal level for having survived and gone through it.
Yeah. The other thought I had about what you mentioned, that there was no sense of achievement or victory, is that, I appeared actually publicly talking about this from the very beginning of the war, directly after the attacks. I said, listen, there's obviously going to be a war, but what will you achieve with it? There's a huge difference between the justification of the war and the actual how, why, and where you want to end up as a as a result of the war. And those are two
Absolutely.
different things. Like, there's no one arguing that this wasn't a justified war, that of course there was going to be a war after this. But
But where do we find ourselves at the end of it?
where do you find yourselves afterwards? The creation of a better reality for yourselves.
Yeah.
And actually, because these two peoples and this whole conflict, the weird thing is that creating a better reality on both sides is actually the requirement for a victory. A better political, just better life on both sides of the fence is the only way to win, because the fates of these peoples are intertwined. They live together.
Yeah, we're sort of married to each other for better, for worse.
Yeah.
And maybe we should get a divorce, but it should be a clean divorce with respect.
From the very get-go, I was saying that this is going to be very hard to achieve anything that you can call a victory. In the north, later on, they did, and that's great. But in Gaza specifically, and the West Bank. And the other thing I had is I think this has actually been the problem with all Western countries or democracies fighting insurgencies and other terrorists in the last 50, 60, 70 years, has been that the sense of achievement and victory is never there, especially not for the soldiers. Like, just a few days ago, I recorded an episode, which is live now, actually. Check your phone. I'm sure you're a subscriber.
I love talking, yes.
Yeah, so I just recorded with Richard, who talked a lot about Northern Ireland. There's no sense of achievement there either. And so I'm just saying that sense of achievement of victory, when was the last war that any democracy or Western country fought where
Yeah.
where they had
Well,
that
so
feeling?
actually, I would contrast what you're saying a little bit. Like, I wouldn't say I didn't have a sense of achievement. Like, it was more that I knew that the fighting wasn't over. And I knew that this was going to be a long process and that we were nowhere near victory. I did feel like I had fulfilled something important, like knowing that my family was behind me, like an hour and a half drive away. And I was putting myself in between them and the absolute barbarism that Hamas has made itself clearly capable of. That was incredibly meaningful. That was, I felt great about that. But like you're saying, it's very hard for us to define what victory is going to be coming out of this conflict. I think that's a big topic of discussion now for good reason, but especially so because recently in the headlines, there's talk about um, just as many Hamas fighters that have been recruited since the beginning of the war as the amount that have been killed, right? So it's like we're running in place here. And it's really not true. I mean, I've looked at the data and I've looked at like the reality on the ground as much as I could. I've spoken to a lot of different people who have a lot of knowledge about these things, and it's not really true that we haven't done any damage to Hamas. First of all, like Gaza is basically uninhabitable in much of its landmass right now. That's going to make it difficult for Hamas to continue to operate in the long run. I guess we'll see how that one plays out. But I think something that's like kind of been, a hot topic of discussion now is, yeah, what is victory? Or, you're creating more hatred by acting in Gaza and by carrying out this operation. And for me, like all victory is for my family and my friends and for the people of the south of Israel to live peacefully and not have to fear everywhere they go. For a time period before the war and also during the war, I remember I would go for jogs. And there was a period, this predates October 7th, but it was especially pronounced afterwards, that I would go on these jogs and I would notice that like I would be running with headphones in, and sometimes I would just like kind of run past somebody in the park and like startle the crap out of them without ever intending to. And for me, the victory is ending that for my people. If I create some new enemies in the long run by achieving that goal, then that's just a necessary symptom. Obviously, I still expect of myself and my military outfit and the entire IDF as a whole to operate morally with a value on human life, minimalizing casualties of civilians as much as possible. That is without a question a part of it, because otherwise, what's the point? But for me, I'm not as much focused on like these philosophical questions about like, you're creating more hatred and more terror. Like, if it's practical, then yes. But for me, it's about an entirely utilitarian perspective. I want peace and quiet for my people, and I don't want to cause any unnecessary suffering for the the innocent people that exist in Gaza. And obviously there are some. Obviously not everyone in Gaza is responsible for all the actions of Hamas. There's much to be said there.
Yeah.
I'm
Uh,
kind of
I
rambling.
think, I mean, yeah, I know, but this issue, obviously, for many maybe listeners, we are the authoritative voices in their lives about this conflict. But let me just say that there are more, there are smarter voices out there, but I agree with everything you're saying, and then all I can think of is that, yeah, but so it seems like the only way to do that is to create peace and quiet on the other side too. And how do you do that? And is it like
What I was trying to address in my long and rambling statement was basically this idea that, like, the only reason that people jumped across the border on October 7th, both the people enlisted by Hamas and civilians, and jumped across the border and strangled babies and raped people to death and shot at civilians from point blank range. The only reason they did it is because they don't have PlayStation 3, or, fine, obviously even more practical than that, they don't have the basic human needs that need to be met to be, to feel like they're getting. It's mostly bullshit. Okay, I don't buy that. The reason that those people hopped across the border is because those people believe that it is their purpose in life to kill as many Jews as possible and to destroy the state of Israel. That, I mean, the people who unfortunately lived the reality of Gaza under blockade for the last 20 years and who are having, a terrible life because of it, I don't think that those people are turning to jihad as a solution. And if there's evidence to show me that, there is actually a large number of people who are otherwise normal and are joining up with Hamas, then I'll be willing to talk about it. But for now, for me, the most important thing is we cannot make it possible for an organization like Hamas to ever perpetrate what it did on October 7th again. That's the goal, okay?
Yeah, no, and I'm with you on that, with the in the principle, and I agree with the emotion of it. I just don't see how we are any closer to that now than we ever were. I mean, obviously they took this major card up their sleeve, which is they kidnapped hundreds of Israelis, and the prisoner swaps are costing you any of the achievements that you or your colleagues on the ground made in terms of sort of military achievement. It's all being negated by prisoner swaps that are necessary because we aren't like them. We're not going to leave our people just to die in tunnels if they're still alive. We're going to give them all the fucking murderers and terrorists they want from the prisons and take them. Just give us back whoever's alive, and fine, and you're negating everything. So then what's next?
That element of it does feel like we're running in place. But fortunately, in the 21st century, numbers aren't the only thing that matters. So, for me, like, I recently watched a news segment on Israeli broadcast about people whose families were affected by terrorist attacks in the past and who are watching their killers basically run loose. It is insanity that we are releasing hundreds of murderers in exchange for civilians who were kidnapped, who, like, watch their families die in front of them. And it's incredibly frustrating and incredibly sad to watch. I can't imagine what these families are going through right now. But all that being said, like, these people will, if we conduct a military operation that is as elaborate as it should be and as methodical as it should be, then they won't be able to stage that kind of an attack again from any of our borders, whether or not they have another 600 barbarians or not. Like, it doesn't matter to me.
No, it's just not just another 600 of them released from prison. That's not the point. That part of the prisoner swaps is also ground, actual strategic assets. Like Israel had the
Ceasefire.
Netzarim corridor in the middle of Gaza that basically split it in two and allowed them to control the flow of traffic, humans and goods, and you're giving up the Egyptian Gaza border
Right.
by the Rafah crossing into Egypt, and all of that will be a price to pay. So what did this war achieve in the end? Because this deal, arguably now, and this is a horrible thing to say for those who died in this war, had family members killed, injured, whatever. I'm just saying that these prisoner swaps could have been done before the war.
That's
Why didn't we
true.
go into them right away?
Well, first of all, it's not 100% clear that they could have been done before the war. It's
The
not. It
price
really
would have
isn't.
been a lot higher, I think, yeah.
The price might have been higher, but also part of the goals, one of the major goals of the war was to, take away their ability to do what they did. Like if we just got back our hostages, if I was in command, let's say, and we got back our hostages at the very beginning of the war in some major deal, I would have mobilized the military immediately after the hostages were returned. Without some kind of military achievement in Gaza, you're right, this whole thing is pointless. But what I'm saying is, like, the deal now, give or take some of the Rafah crossing, the Philadelphia corridor, who's responsible for the crossings to Egypt now and who's going to overlook them. I think those are all things that could be figured out in the future.
Yeah.
When you see those two Israeli men who were forced to watch the last ceremony from a van, and they knew that they weren't going out, and they filmed that video. Did you see this? You know what I'm referring to?
Yeah. So basically they had two other hostages who they took to watch the others being released, and they filmed them.
Yeah, and they filmed them
Watching the
begging
other.
Netanyahu to let them go and to stop being such a schmuck, and begging for their families to do everything they
That
could
guy
to.
is a fucking schmuck. I think schmuck is a gentle word for it, but
Yeah,
Jesus.
I mean, I would agree in part, but it's not really important right now. The fact is that those two guys are in there, and I really, really want them back. So, and every Israeli feels that way.
So currently, for those who don't know what we're talking about is currently the number is there are still 59 Israelis held hostage in Gaza. And by the way, my verbiage made me sound like some fucking BBC reporter. These aren't prisoner swaps. It makes it sound like we're swapping prisoners of war. The vast majority of the Israeli hostages held by Hamas in the tunnels were people kidnapped out of their beds, whereas
Civilians.
the vast majority of people being released by Israel are convicted murderers.
Yes.
Or not necessarily convicted murderers, but convicted other people who've gone through a court system in a country that most of the time respects the rule of law, and there's some kind of reason why they're being held in a prison.
And then, of course, some civilians who hopped over the fence and joined in the festivities of October 7th.
Yeah. And I want to say also, when we talked about the price here, let me give some more context here. A lot of the people still left, if they are alive, in the tunnels as hostages. We're talking young men and soldiers. And when you and I joined the army, they had just completed the previous hostage deal with Hamas. And one Israeli soldier cost something like 1,035.
Over 1,000,
Palestine. Yeah, over 1,000 to 1 was the ratio. So far, with these civilians that include dead bodies of babies they strangled to death, by the way. So far, the price has been something like 60 to 1. The Palestinians released versus one hostage back to Israel. And if the price back then was over 1,000 to 1 for the soldiers, then the price will go up now. They're talking about stage 2, and stage 2 basically just means that the price will go up. And now Hamas will want the big names, the household names, basically the Osama bin Ladens of this conflict. So we're talking the Barghoutis and all those guys.
Yeah, that's precisely so. And so, yeah, like, I want these guys back, and I don't really care. Like, it would be really nice if the Mossad was working on something where they slip a beeper in every one of these prisoners' asses, figure something out like that. But I don't really care. I think, like, my personal take, and it's very personal. It's something that is in part based on emotion, in part based on, like, my life philosophy. When some people agree with me in Israel and some people don't. But for me, I think, like, we should get those two living hostages back, basically at any cost. And
Only
then
two of them are alive now?
Well, we know two are alive. There's some signs of life from a couple of others, we think, based on reports of hostages who were exchanged for, and what they're telling us. But yeah, I think my sense is that the majority of them are no longer with us.
Yeah.
But anyways, like, if you ask me, it's like, at this point, just get them back. Those are our people back there. And then let's go back to the freaking drawing board and make strategic accomplishments.
It's time to play their game, which is manipulation. I know that there are religious considerations and emotional considerations. If you can get the ones who are still alive back, and if there's no sign of life of anyone else, that's when you do what they've been doing the whole time. You pretend to be negotiating, but you try to get all of these military achievements that you've done in the last year and a half, you try to get them all back and say, at the end of the day, you're holding bodies. We're not gonna pay a price for those bodies.
Actually, on October 7th, when I was getting my bags ready and getting stuff together, after I decided to go back, one of the things I did was write a letter. I wrote two letters. I wrote one letter to my wife, to be opened when I was on the plane already. And then I gave her another piece of paper to be opened only if and when the worst outcome has happened, if I was killed in action. And on that piece of paper, I wrote confidently, under no circumstances are my remains to be traded for, in any kind of political swap for prisoners. Just
Yeah,
freaking leave me there. I don't know if like anyone would have respected those wishes, but that's really how I feel. Like I don't want my remains to be the cause of more broken families in my country. Some
exactly.
people have a different take on that, as you were alluding to before. There are people with religious beliefs in Israel, and this is not unique to Judaism. It exists in other cultures as well. But
Mm.
that, the remains of someone are holy and need to be properly buried according to religious tradition. And so for that reason, it's a very controversial issue
And
right
there
now.
is actually some practical considerations too. Like, it's not just that. It's if you're considered missing rather than officially dead,
Right.
then the families, it's all fucked up. Like,
Right.
your phone contract will keep going, and the families have to pay any loans, any phone contracts, any internet contracts you sign up for. Your family will have to keep paying those.
I don't think that's not been a major part of the discourse that I've heard of. I didn't realize that was such a big issue. I mean, I do know that it's complicated in terms of like, if you go missing in action, like there's a famous soldier from I think it was like the 70s or 80s so his airplane malfunctioned over Syria. He was ejected, landed somewhere. There were negotiations ongoing for trying to get him back. We knew that he was alive at some point, and then that's it. He fell off the radar. We have no idea if he's still alive or how long he was alive for, if he's dead. What was his name again?
Run around, yeah.
Ron Arad. Thank you. So that's a piece of history that's coming back a lot now, also because no family wants to be left in the dark like that and not know, if their loved one is alive out there somewhere or not. And that's why you're making a good point where like, there's a big difference between someone who is verified KIA versus someone who's just gone missing in the madness
Yeah.
of it all.
Yeah. If you still have the energy, I would love to talk about what this does to you, like the stress of the war, and not just the war. Everything we've talked about actually adds to your stress. You're from there, your family lives there, and it's all stressful. But I think for you and also for us who are listening, I think we're very lucky that you're doing this immediately, like almost immediately, which is trying to sort of recognize what you thought and felt about certain things. And I think that will help you avoid any negative mental stuff later on. But do you have any like loud bangs on streets? Are you jumpy or anything like that?
So actually for me, in terms of the like jumpiness, it's actually the opposite. So I found myself in situations where like crazy shit is going on or loud noises are happening, and actually my nervous system is probably less quick to react than normal. Like, if I'm with somebody, I remember once like there was this really loud truck that just suddenly took off from a red light, and I was with a couple of my friends getting lunch, and like they all suddenly like jumped back from the street, and I was just like standing there. So actually, like for whatever reason, my body had the opposite kind of reaction.
Yeah.
What is typical for PTSD. I've had some like pretty fucked up dreams. I've noticed that, in the early days after I was released, it was harder for me to be patient. Now I have two small kids, and I remember there was a time that my temper would grow quickly and my fuse was a little shorter. I've been thankfully in a very supportive place. Like I have a very supportive family, and I've been given some time to go off on my own. I spent some time in Nepal, just walking in the mountains a little bit and volunteering there. I took a couple of trips here and there and
Yeah,
into nature.
what a wife you have who first lets you go
Yeah,
fight in silly penis wars, and then lets you go, like, you go debrief yourself in on a mountain on your own while she's
yeah.
taking care of the
While she's
kids.
taking
Yeah.
care of two small kids with
Yeah, yeah.
tons of energy. Yeah, honestly, like I really, there's just no words. She's been wonderful throughout. Been very, very lucky. Just I've been given all the space and support that I need. But yeah, it's been tough. Some of the now I'm in a much better place, but there was a point where it felt like reality wasn't quite real. Especially, by the way, when I came back to the US and I was in a major US city where There were all kinds of chumps going to protests, holding Hamas flags and Hezbollah flags. And it doesn't really make sense. Like this is all such a freaking joke with people who, claim that they're feminists or claim that they're queer activists holding these flags. It kind of having my reality shaken up like that. I'll just give you one example from that, which is kind of crazy. So there are like three Jewish artists who my wife was into, and they're all dead now. I think that they all had, two out of the three of them had AIDS. They were popular in the 80s, and there was a display on with their stuff in a museum in a major US city. And actually, they were also Holocaust survivors or the descendants of Holocaust survivors. But so we went into into the city to go see this thing. And, I don't really care for this stuff. I just go along to make her happy. And we're standing in line to get tickets. And then when we get to the register to pay, the cashier is classic liberal type with the haircut and the outfit and the whole like tone of speaking of the upspeak. And it's fine, like, it doesn't bother me at all. I'll live and let live. But then I see on her chest is a Palestine flag pin. And ostensibly, she's not Middle Eastern. She doesn't have any family there, I don't think. But it felt to me that it was just so crazy. Like, this woman was standing representing an art installation that was the creative work of like three Holocaust survivors, Jews. And, she probably throws around the G word, genocide. And for me, it was just like so mentally distressing that on my Saturday morning where I was just trying to like have a pleasant time with my wife, like it's everywhere. These people are everywhere, distorting the truth, distorting the reality of what's going on, distorting the reality of what happened in the middle of the 20th century. Distorting the lessons we should have drawn from fascism that clearly people are missing. So it was a lot of little experiences like that that really fucked with me, that really made me feel like I'm living in some bizarro world where like somebody's playing with my head. That was very...
And you are, because this shit is also not an accident. Like, this shit is funded on purpose. I'm sorry, the dum-dums of the world out there, it's fine, believe in what you believe in. And for you, by the way, you need to find it within you not to ruin your own day, because people out there are fucking dum-dums. And there's nothing you can do about it. But they, like, I just, if I'm reaching any of them by accident, I just want to say, like, listen, it isn't an accident. Because you have certain personality traits and tendencies that make you think in a certain way, which lead you to maybe left-wing Marxist ideas and certain jobs that are in that realm. That's all great, by the way. That we need you. We need people who want to help people and want to talk about solidarity in a community and all that. We need that shit. I support a lot of that shit. But it's not an accident that those people have also, as basically a glorified fashion statement, allied themselves with certain conflicts around the world, and that some of it is funded by people that are doing this on purpose. And that would be back in the day the KGB was funding, in the Cold War was funding so-called subversive ideas in universities in the West. And nowadays it's Hezbollah, Iran, Qatar. These kind of people are actually funding this stuff. Like, it's not an accident that those are the only ideas you hear.
Not only is it not an accident, it's actually very, very useful. Even though we laugh about these stupid dum-dums, as you call them, and we kind of play it off like no big deal. Okay, they're like shutting down campuses. That's actually an incredibly serious leverage that Hamas had over, let's say, like the Biden administration. Like that was a blunder for them, and it was in the news every day. It looks horrible, and they had to placate to this ideology while they were running an election. It's not just child's play, unfortunately. I wish it were, and then it would be a lot harder for this moron to ruin my day. She actually didn't ruin my day. It was just like an hour or two of like tension, and then it was over. But you get my drift.
Yeah, but when that shit happens, and this is from personal experience, and I never ever said it out loud, I kept all of that shit. At the end of the day, actually, it might not ruin your day, but it's the people around you. Suddenly you go quiet, you withdraw, you have these angry thoughts in you, and you think, because like by keeping them in, that means you're not ruining the other people's day, but actually sharing them would let them at least know what's going on, why you suddenly make a fucking face and
For
go
sure.
all withdrawn, you know.
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, I if you're happy to, we do a third chat about.
Heck
Now
yeah.
I have a story for you, like about
Feels
what
good.
went on with me, which I've only like recently in the last couple of years addressed. It's not. I do want to say as my sort of public service announcement, which we do if you've listened to any episodes of Talking Ass. Mine will today will be pretty easy because I think it's important to talk about this stuff and like avoid bad reactions to things, and especially going down these bad paths where your bad reactions to things just make you more and more withdrawn and then affect your relationships and your life and your job and all that.
That's your
But
thinking.
also, don't let like this like fashion trend of everyone wants to have a mental health issue. Honestly, if you're fine, just be fine and be happy. The whole world right now is trying to label everyone with PTSD, ADHD, or AIDS, or whatever fucking four-letter acronym they want to come up with. And like don't, if you're fine, you're fine, and that's great. But on the off chance that, you know, there, it might come later, I think it's I mean, we're always here, and for me, actually, public appearances help the most. I think like out of nowhere after like 10 years of being quiet, and for me, at the end of the day, it wasn't all like war stuff. It was a lot of it is family stuff and like childhood stuff. But it definitely changed who I am just opening up.
Yeah, you got to talk that stuff out. It's all energy, and your nervous system is basically designed to adapt to your surroundings, to adapt to your experience. And if you don't let that energy out in a productive way, it's going to come out in a negative way, or
Yeah.
worse, it'll be stored into your body. And you know, I'm a science man, but I also dabble in the metaphysical, and I think that there's a lot of, you know, truth, and there's a reason. Yeah, definitely aliens, by the way.
Yeah.
They're all named Goldstein, of course. But yeah, you know, talk therapy works for a lot of people for a good reason. You know, just thinking it out, talking it out, getting it out there. Actually, I read a book once, just once, but a good book about psychiatric illnesses and sort of non-conventional approaches to treating them. The Body Keeps the Score. You might have heard of it. And
Mm.
one of the chapters in there, he talks about dealing with PTSD in children and young adults by having them act out the scenes in which they were traumatized. And, you know, it's kind of counterintuitive, right? You would think like, hey, why would you want to make them relive that? But actually, PTSD often is actually rooted in the fact that you didn't act in a way that you wished you had, right? So for some people, that means standing up to your aggressor or to your rapist or to your abuser. Um, and for some people, that's if you discover the animal side of you that exists maybe in a war zone and you're terrified by that could cause PTSD. But so he took his clients through the theater making process with their traumas. And
Mm.
like in a room full of people, obviously it was like people that they knew, and like, you know, they would also play other roles, but by reenacting some of these scenes, both the way in which they occurred in reality and then afterwards in the ways in which they wished they had operated, these people had like really crazy rates of, you know, cure rates. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Great book, by the way.
Yeah. There's that movie that's similar, you know, that documentary about the Cambodian genocide, the Khmer
Khmer Rouge.
Rouge thing
Yeah.
where they reenacted all the killing fields or what it's called.
I
That's
never
like
saw that.
similar principle. Yeah, it's like award winning and stuff.
Mm.
I wanted to ask you, so we talked about this, that the so-called enemies are funding interesting things around the Western world, and one of them is the prosecution of Israeli soldiers who
Yeah.
served in this war. Previous cases have basically just been a face and a name they can match to a location in Gaza, but none of them have any evidence that anyone's ever like done anything wrong. It's just like a social media, a face and a name and a location, and then they can match that to a civilian death toll that probably claimed by Hamas, who I always go to for my facts, by the way.
Great idea.
Yeah. So, any worries about that? Do you think any of that will ever touch you or any of the people you were with?
I'd be lying to you if I said that there was zero concern. Like I said, it was something of a relief to me when you mentioned that this would be only audio. I haven't included too much personal information intentionally. But on the other hand, I think it's kind of disgraceful that I have to keep my head low and have to worry about these things in America in 2025. I grew up in a major American city, was raised in a place where there was a ton of diversity. I was taught to appreciate people for their character, not because of what they looked like or not because of the language they spoke at home. I was totally used to people being different, and that was okay. Likewise, the child of two public servants. My grandfather was a veteran of the Second World War, served in the American Navy, and his siblings served as well. And like, I feel like I've had a true appreciation for what America has represented since its creation and what it's meant to be, really. And I know what I've done. I know what it was like in Gaza. I know what I stand for, and I have no problem sleeping at night, given everything that I've been through and everything that I stand for. But I think the fact that I have to keep my head down in the United States in this day and age is kind of a disgrace. I don't know that I'll always keep my head down. I actually have moments where I feel like I have a certain faith in this place, and I have a certain faith in the American people, that I don't really have to be worried, and that the system will back me up, and, no one's going to try and prosecute me. Maybe someone will try to stick a screwdriver in my back as I walk down the street. I mean, just the other day in the city that I live in, there were people parading Hezbollah flags out, wearing keffiyehs covering their faces. Who knows what they're capable of? But I really believe in what I stand for, and I know that I don't have anything to hide. And just this sensation that like I kind of do, because other soldiers have been prosecuted in other parts of the world, it's been distressing to me a little bit. So yeah, I don't know if I think I answered your question.
No, you did, and I certainly believe it's mostly bullshit. It's again fucking useful pawns.
Yeah.
I mean, very clever people representing a very different side of all of this, using our own Western democracies and our legal systems against us. And we won't torture anyone with a 3-hour video going into this right now, but next we will maybe talk less about this war and all of it, and we'll go into some of the stuff I think you'll be really interested in. So will many of the listeners. I have this fascinating process that I went on in the last couple of years where I basically didn't address any of this stuff for 10 years, and then suddenly like went full on. I started writing and employed like a professional person with me, that I did homework that I set for myself, and like there were weird phenomena, like people that I used to know to the point where I knew their sisters' names and I knew where they lived and stuff, and then saw pictures of them and didn't even know their first name. Like, that's not, I don't know how common that is, but it ain't fucking healthy, right? Then at the end of the day, it will take us all, I mean, the journey's still ongoing, but it will take us to surprising places that maybe it was never about the war in the first place.
Yeah, I'm only vaguely familiar with the process that you've been through in recent years. You haven't talked to me too much about it, but I definitely look forward to hearing more and asking you some of the tough questions.
Yeah, and I'll only do it with you. Nobody else.
Yeah. So, all right. Sounds like a plan.
And thank you so much, buddy. I mean, it's late for me, but fuck it. This was great. I'm so happy we did it.
Me too, man. Me too. Always a pleasure talking to you.
Give a big hug and kiss to your family.
Will do. You do the same, and we'll be in touch. All right?
All right. Good night, buddy.
Take good care. Sweet dreams.